Well, actually my title was given to me, but this is often what we talk about when we give talks from the Everglades Foundation. What are the priorities for Everglades restoration? And before I get started, I just want to point out a couple of acronyms. We heard Don Fox mention CEPP earlier. This is the Central Everglades Planning Project, which is really the current planning process underway to focus the next phase of Everglades restoration. There's also the CERP. This is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This goes back to the WRDA 2000 authorization that I'll talk about in a minute. So when it comes to restoration essentials, we really focus on the ecosystem. I've got a picture here showing wading birds that are concentrated in the landscape. And Dr. Peter Frederick's going to talk about this in a little bit. And really what we do is we monitor things like wading birds, like someone like me who has high blood pressure. I have to monitor my blood pressure. It's an indicator of the health of my heart. But I know that fixing the blood pressure isn't the problem. What I have to do is regulate the quality and quantity of food and alcohol to some extent that I take into my body, right? So with the Everglades, it's really the quality and quantity of water, how we flow it through the ecosystem that really drives these types of indicators that Peter's going to be talking about next. And so when it comes to the essentials, I'm going to give you the answer right here on the very first slide. One is to improve the quality of the water that we have flowing into the ecosystem. We know that the system is very sensitive to degradation in water quality. We need to restore the Kissimmee River. This is the source of the water that historically drove the system. And by channelizing that, we cut off a vast area of wetland, of floodplain, that was once connected, that not only stored water, but helped to treat it as it made its way down to the lake. At the same time, because we've lost all of that storage south of Lake Okeechobee and we can't flow the water the way we used to do it, we need water storage to meet these multiple needs for Central Everglades and Florida Bay, to flow that water back to the south where it went historically, as opposed to where it's going right now when the lake is full. We have to send it out the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries. We also need storage in different places, and the Kissimmee is probably the most natural likely source of this to protect Lake Okeechobee. And ultimately, once we can do all of this, we need to flow the water in a more natural way, and we use the term decompartmentalization to describe how we're going to achieve that natural flow, and it's really just removing barriers to flow. And to really illustrate that, let's look at the Everglades historically. What we thought, I guess our best guess at what the system looked like historically. You see that vast, let me find the laser here, that vast free-flowing open ecosystem from Lake Okeechobee all the way to the south, the highest ground being that whitish ridge, which is the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. This is the area that we first developed. Well, look at today. We've got a highly compartmentalized ecosystem. We've got this massive population that overspilled that Atlantic Coastal Ridge to the west. So we've eroded away the wetland area that the Everglades once had. We've got about 50% of the footprint left, and we've got a highly fragmented ecosystem, largely because of the Central and South Florida project that was designed to provide us with not only water, but flood control mainly. As populations were growing in this area that was once a wetland, we needed a way to draw that water off the landscape. And that system, designed for 2 million people, is working today for a population greater than 6 million. So it's achieving its purpose in terms of water supply and flood control, but we also know that there came an ecological cost of having this infrastructure that highly fragments the ecosystem, that prevents the natural flow of water through the system, and Peter's going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I want to really take this fast forward to 2000, because that's when the plan to fix the system was authorized and signed by President Clinton at the time, WRDA 2000. Well, a lot has happened since 2000, and we need to think about this as we're planning for restoration, because it's 13 years later. And to put how a lot of things have changed, I think about my daughter who's a 10-year-old, and she thinks that iPod is like a rock. or maybe fire. This is like old technology that Grandma probably had in her day. But really, the iPod's only been around since 2001. But think about how our lives have changed with the advent of these technologies just over the last decade plus. So over this period of time, we found that pythons are a problem. We realized that in 2000, they were actually established in Everglades National Park. We've established that we've got a water quality problem, and the state has been working on a solution to fixing that with their long-term water quality plan, which led to the construction of over 50,000 acres of treatment wetlands in the Everglades agricultural area. This is the largest treatment wetland network in the world. We've had hurricanes, drought, fire. We've even had a really nasty cold snap in the winter 2009-2010. We've learned a lot how these disturbances impact the ecosystem that feed back into our understanding of how to restore it ultimately. Because really it comes down to too much water, lack of water, water flowing through the system. On that note, we've had changes in operations of the system, not only at the lake, but also further downstream in how the water conservation areas are managed. And we've been monitoring the changes that take place as a result of all these activities. We've finally become to the point where we've seen restoration projects implemented, not completely, but partially. So we've got the C-111 Canal Spreader project that's been active for just over a year now. We've got a 1-mile bridge on Tamiami Trail, and the roadbed is currently being removed. These are really ways of getting more water back into the system. Picayune Strand, a significant habitat restoration project in Collier County, about 55,000 acres. So this is a massive projects, but really the thing to keep in mind is that the projects that we've implemented thus far or have broken ground on have focused on the periphery of the system. We really haven't gotten to the complexities of restoring the heart of the Everglades, and I'll talk about that as an example. And at the same time, over this period, we've had about 150 peer-reviewed technical publications per year. So we're generating a lot of science, and we need to go back and revisit what we've learned over the last 13 years in order to really maximize our dollar invested in Everglades restoration. One of the things that we've learned over this time frame is that there was actually more water in the historic system than what we thought. So we've actually gone back and revised our historic flow targets. And I don't want to get into these graphics too much, but I'll just point out that the pre-drainage Everglades is this purple line here. So you can see that it reached its peak, and it was a much higher peak than where we are currently in the orange flow, the orange line here. So you can see that it was significantly higher, but yet the highest water periods were shifted later in the season. That's because that water was making its way all the way down the Kissimmee, through the lake, and into the central Everglades, almost at the end of the wet season because of that vast area that it had to move. And you can also see by this figure that that water is persisting throughout much of the dry season. So you really don't reach the lowest of the lows until the wet season begins the next year. That's the way the natural system worked. And that also translates downstream, and we know that with an open Everglades, that water was making its way further down into Everglades National Park, where this yellow line crosses here, the main flow path, Shark River Slough. But the way the system's managed today, we know that that water backs up along Tamiami Trail. I don't want to talk about this, but just to point out that as we're looking at flows through the system, we've identified historic transects, and I'm going to talk about this L1 transect that flows down the westernmost path. And so this is what the ground surface elevation in maroon versus the water surface elevation in blue looked like. This is basically how an open, free-flowing system works. You have consistent depths all across the system. That water's flowing almost like a river of grass, if you will, all the way down. This is the way it was so eloquently described by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. But look at today. With these barriers to flow, we have a huge disconnect in the way the system works. This is almost functioning like a dam. Water backs up against Tamiami Trail, this barrier right here. So you can see high water here at the dam, and low water at the upper end. We can't bring more water down without removing that barrier to flow. So that's a priority for restoration. But when you think about removing barriers to flow or unplugging the drain in your tub, if you don't turn the faucet on at the top, the system's going to go dry very quickly. So setting the flow issue aside, the quantity of water, we also know that water quality is a big problem. We have a lot of pollution coming in from agricultural sources, from urban sources, different parts of the system, and we know that contributes to a loss of habitat quality. We go from what was once a very diverse ridge and slough habitat with a number of different species occupying the open water areas and the edges of these sawgrass ridges, periphyton indicating good water quality. You can see the variation in topography. That is a healthy Everglades ecosystem. When we add phosphorus, we know that ultimately we end up with a loss of that habitat heterogeneity and nothing but cattail. And really, if we get down to the guts of this, and this is what the latest scientific information has taught us, is that these changes take place in a matter of days to weeks. And it starts with the breakdown and loss of the periphyton mat. It seems to be the most sensitive to changes in phosphorus concentration. As we load phosphorus, we start to see that disappear, ultimately leading up to changes in landscape pattern and ultimately changes in fish, crayfish, so the invertebrate community structure, everything changes as a result of this. And the Water Management District's done a really good job of mapping the impacts and the changes, the progression of this nutrient pollution downstream. This is in Water Conservation Area 2A, and you can see just going from 1991 to 2003, this is about an 11, 12-year period of time, you're seeing an expansion of that zone, more red relative to yellow. So I mentioned the network of treatment wetlands that the state has implemented as a result of their long-term water quality plan. This is the Everglades agricultural area here in Brown, Lake Okeechobee up here to the north. As water comes off these agricultural lands, we need to treat it. And we need to bring that water down to what has been identified as a 10 part per billion threshold for phosphorus. Just to give you an idea, this is cleaner than bottled water. This is the equivalent of taking an Olympic-sized swimming pool and dropping less than a teaspoon of phosphorus into it and mixing it up. This is really clean, and this is what the Everglades is accustomed to, basically the quality of rainwater. So as a result of the outcome of this long-term water quality plan, there was a need to do more. We know that we're not achieving this phosphorus standard with the existing network of stormwater treatment areas. So the new plan, this restoration strategies in 2012, is going to bring about 6,500 acres new stormwater treatment area. These are in the brighter green, as well as increased storage or flow-through wetlands that we're calling flow equalization basins. And these are essentially surge tanks to maximize the efficiency of phosphorus uptake in these stormwater treatment areas. The thing to point out is that the completion time for this is 2025. So we're looking at a pretty extended timeline here for achieving the phosphorus standard with just the existing water flowing into the Everglades. This isn't restoring the quantity of water. This is just restoring the existing flows into the ecosystem. And the cost here of $800 million, that raises eyebrows. That's a big number. But if anything, it should point to how degraded the ecosystem is and how we should really focus as much of our energies on dealing with the problem at the source as much as we can, because it's cheaper to focus on the problem at the source as opposed to at the downstream end. Well, getting back to SEP versus SERP, SEP is really SERP. It's not a reformulation of that comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. It's taking components that were in that plan and making them better with the updated scientific information, modeling tools that we have. But also, I think anyone that's been involved with this process, whether it's a hunter, a fisherman, or just an environmental interest group, they have all just acknowledged that there's been a significant amount of public involvement, stakeholder input into this process. And the ultimate plan that's coming out of this, I think, everyone is not going to be happy with every component of it, but for the most part, we have pretty broad support. Well, what are the goals of SEP? In general, it's to try to steer as much of that flow to the south, relieving those discharges to the northern estuaries as much as we can. Delivering new clean water to the central Everglades, and trying as much as we can to restore sheet flow, which ultimately leads to habitat improvements in that ridge and slough topography, as well as the tree islands that we have out in the Everglades ecosystem. Well, since WRDA 2000, we've also established a set of performance metrics. These are system-wide. They're used to not only evaluate different restoration scenarios, one relative to the other, to help identify a plan, but we also use these same performance measures to assess the success of project implementation. So these are really powerful tools, and they're based on science and attributes of the ecosystem, and largely they're driven by water quality and water quantity and flow aspects of the ecosystem. Everything comes back to getting the water right. Somebody, I think it was Don that mentioned earlier, you get the water right, the birds will come, and that's the way it is in the Everglades as well. And so you can establish targets as desired conditions, and also an important component of this is that they're robust. They apply across the entire ecosystem, and they're feasible, relatively cost-effective to keep track of. Well, in SEP, we had to consider both water quality and water quantity, so it's building on that infrastructure that's going to be implemented as a result of the restoration strategies plan that I talked about a minute ago. And really, the focus was on existing lands. And this red square there is the existing lands that we had to deal with for both storage and treatment of new water coming down as a result of SEP. It's about 14,000 acres. So we're not going to be able to relieve all of the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie problems with just this footprint, but we can take a significant bite out and work from there. The question early on was whether to build a deep reservoir here or focus it as a flow equalization basin, as I described earlier, a flow-through wetland. And so the early performance screening looked at things like how much new flow can we steer south with this infrastructure, how much will it relieve dry season conditions in the Everglades, and what relief will it provide to those northern estuaries. I'll just say that the flow equalization basin did really well in terms of the amount of flow that it brought south. It's greater than 200,000 acre-feet per year, which is a significant amount of water. It's relatively cost-effective. It's about a third of the cost of what the deep reservoir would have cost to construct. But since it's a flow-through system as opposed to this massive tank, it doesn't achieve as much in terms of the dry standard improvement or relief to the estuaries, but it's a significant first step forward, and that's what we need to keep in mind. Peter's going to talk about this in his talk, but I just want to say that in addition to the quality and quantity of water, we need to focus on the landscape pattern in the Everglades. I talked about the importance of ridge and slough in that water quality illustration I showed earlier, but we need to have this landscape pattern across the Everglades as well as a natural hydro period, a rise and fall seasonally in the water level in order to concentrate the fish that are growing out in the marsh when water levels are high. As those dry season evaporation increases, you get concentration of that food into pools, and that's really what drives the ecosystem and what leads to the performance of this one indicator that obviously we all feel is very important across the system. Well, we know that we're losing that landscape pattern, and I know these images don't show it quite well, but these are taken at different points across the ecosystem, and I'm going to do a slight Photoshop manipulation here just to show you how much we've lost landscape pattern in different parts of the system, either because the water's too deep or because it's too dry, and I'll talk about how dryness affects this part of the system, but this area in the middle, it's kind of like Goldilocks. It's too deep down here, it's too dry up here, so that is our reference site for good landscape pattern, and it's just fortuitous that it's in the middle of that water conservation area. This is largely driven by loss of soil. So this is highly organic peat soils that we have in the Everglades, and we know that over a significant period of time, this is about 30, actually this is 27 years, or 17 or so, I can't read that, but a couple of decades, we've lost as much as 2 to 3 feet of soil elevation in some of these areas because you over-dry these areas. That organic matter is like compost. It just decomposes, and you lose soil elevation, you lose landscape pattern as a result. We also know that because of this imbalance in water levels that I showed you on that graph earlier, we're losing tree islands. All of the red areas indicate areas where we're losing or have lost tree islands in Water Conservation Area 3A, and it's just because the system is dammed, it's too deep at one end, it's too dry at another end. So with the Central Everglades Planning Project, we're focused on that area and trying to get the water right, removing barriers to flow, trying to degrade some of the levees that are piling water on one side and not delivering enough to the other. And we need to bring more flow down, and some of the new science suggests that we should try to pulse that water if we can to rebuild some of that lost landscape pattern, that corrugation in the landscape we know was driven by pulses in flow in the natural system. And obviously moving that water along the historic flow path is important, so the distribution as well as those seasonal targets, getting the water where it needs to be in the wet season and where it needs to be in the dry season is important. And so I'm going to focus on 2 areas of the Central Everglades Planning Project, Northwestern Water Conservation Area 3A, and down here at the interface between 3A, 3B, and Everglades National Park, and the kind of consideration that went into the aspects that are ultimately ending up in the plan. And so here in Northwestern 3A, the question was, how do we introduce that flow? Do we introduce it as a single point of spreading water out into Northwestern 3A and just let it flow? Or do we introduce it across that entire interface of Northern 3A? These 3 alternatives were the same at the top, but all very different at the bottom. And this was different at the top and had a similar kind of feature down at the bottom. That's why these are designed this way. But what we realize is that from a cost-effective standpoint, all we've got to do is introduce water into Northwestern 3A. It will seek its own path. It will achieve the maximal flow along that historic path. And this involves significant input from the recreation community, particularly the hunters in Northern 3A were involved with the development of this aspect of the plan. Moving down into Southern 3A, and how do we decompartmentalize the system? So this is at the interface of 3A, 3B, and Everglades National Park. Well, if we think about how the system worked historically, it was this massive sheet flow. You can almost see the patterning in the landscape. This is how it flowed. And this is where the River of Grass bent towards the southwest and flowed out to the Gulf of Mexico. We no longer see that today. This is the way largely flows are moving through the system. They're being shunted down the canals, and then that water is being introduced into the western segment of Tamiami Trail, into a marsh area that is much higher relative to that bend in the River of Grass. And I'll show you a graph here that shows that. So here's that western high elevation marsh. You can see the land surface elevation in black. This is the bend in the River of Grass, the deepest part. You can see the land surface elevation there. The way we manage the system currently out the S12 structures, we're effectively trying to dump water onto a flat table surface that's highly vegetated. And we're scratching our heads as to why we can't flow more water out of Water Conservation Area 3A. This is why. As we restore the system, we can put it back in the main channel of the River of Grass and flow it much more efficiently. And you can see the disconnect between these water levels just in the way it's managed. And today I can tell you there's about a 3-foot head difference between this side of the park and this side of the park here, just based on the way the water is managed. So how do we move water across these barriers to flow? These are the L67 canals. They have levees alongside of them. You see a lot of water over here. You can see less water here in the pocket and very little water over here. Also note that we have landscape patterning over here. We start to lose it here, and it's completely lost in Water Conservation Area 3B. So we're in CEP considering how we'll flow that water across that boundary. At the downstream end, the question is, how do we get that water across Tamiami Trail? Well, here, as we're driving west along Tamiami Trail, you can see the Tamiami Canal and the L29 levee at the southern end of 3B. Well, here we're building a 1-mile bridge that's completed at this point. But so the point is, we can flow water under Tamiami Trail if we raise the road with a bridge. But decompartmentalizing also involves removal of this L29 levee and opening up the flow in a more natural way. And so as part of the SEP plan, the question was, well, do we just keep the system operating as it currently is? Do we add pumps to Water Conservation Area 3B, so as we deliver water through gates from 3A to 3B, we'll just pump it out? Well, that requires a lot of infrastructural cost, and it's highly unnatural. The ultimate aspect that was selected for the plan was to flow it in as natural a way as we possibly can. This involves construction of an unnatural structure, which is this red line here. This is effectively a river training feature, and I liken it to a prosthesis because the system is so degraded, we have to provide it with a mechanism to flow water along its natural historic flow path. And so I'll show that in a minute. The first question was, can we flow this water? Have we lost so much soil elevation that it's just going to pool in one area? And this just shows the elevations in these different sites going from here in 3A to 3B into Everglades National Park. So we realized, yeah, we can flow it, even though we've got some significant differences here. But we used the modeling output to really convince people that we need some kind of flowway to move the water more efficiently, because if you look here, once you introduce water into Water Conservation Area 3B, this triangle piece here, it just flows to the east. We want it to flow south, as it did historically. It's flowing to the east. We need some kind of mechanism for constraining that flow to get it to flow into Everglades National Park. This gives people heartburn. Building a new levee to restore the Everglades, it gives me heartburn. But this is the only way that we're going to achieve this first step of Everglades restoration. So let's think about stepping back and looking at how it achieves these different restoration priorities. Well, it was greatly facilitated by new science. It brings new water from the lake. It treats it, it stores it, it flows that water in a more natural way through the ecosystem. It shifts water from the west, where we don't want it, over to the east, where it needs to go. And it also has benefits projected all the way down to Florida Bay. So we've got a project here that not only provides some relief for the northern estuaries, it brings new water into the ecosystem, but it also has benefits all the way down into Florida Bay. It has a cost-effective infrastructure. I showed you a few examples of that earlier. And we also know through the modeling that as we increase our storage capacity in the EAA, we can flow more water through this infrastructure just as it is designed. We also have to consider flood control and water supply aspects. That's all included in the plan. And we also stand to learn a lot from this because we've never really taken a bite in terms of restoration like this before. We're going to learn about our capacity to restore lost ridge and slough habitat, about how the system responds as a whole, et cetera. So I just want to end by acknowledging that this isn't my work. This is really the labor of the SEP planning team, and that starts at the water management districts and SEP modeling group, the eco sub-team that was involved with this. A lot of the agencies that are here today have folks that were involved with that. The PDT led by the Water Management District and the Corps, and folks like Bob Johnson at Everglades National Park, just really knowledgeable people that provided this information. And if I have time, I'll take any questions. Thank you.